Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe and good morning to our viewers here in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, and I'm the president of the American Council on Germany. I'm very pleased today to be able to continue our series of summer book recommendations, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome and to introduce ACG Young Leader alum and historian Timothy Ryback. In his work, Tim looks at the nexus of history, politics, and culture, and his most recent book was published this spring. It's titled Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power. And in that book, he explores the 6 months leading up to Adolf Hitler's seizure of power in January of 1933. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Tim, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Steve.
So, Tim, there are so many books about Hitler. He is really a focus of attention for a lot of people and has been, throughout the post-World War II period. Why did you think it was necessary to write yet another book about Hitler and his rise to power?
Yes, Steve, that's a question that a lot of people asked. In fact, there was Adam Gopnik basically said the same thing in his review in the New Yorker of Takeover, and he begins it with, sort of basically, why in God's name do we need another book on Adolf Hitler? Then you imagine, as a writer, you begin reading, you go, oof. And he goes on to say, well, not only was this book timely, but it was wise and even inspired. Those are his words, not mine. But it just felt like the times were right to tell this particular story. And I guess the two things that I felt, if the book adds anything to the Hitler scholarship or the Weimar Republic scholarship writ large, it is, first of all, that I looked at a 6-month period, basically from July 32 until 11 o'clock in the morning on January 30th, 1933. So it's a very tight time frame. The book is, 400 pages. So it's a pretty in-depth exploration of that particular time period. But more importantly, I think, was the perspective that I took. As I think it's the job of historians we know it's the job of historians to explain why we got to where we are from here to there. And what that does, so what it is, when you begin looking at that, you work backwards and you look at those events and those facts that help explain the course of where we ended up. It often it can lend a sense of historical inevitability to events. I decided to forget all of that and begin looking simply at the daily press as of sort of July 1932, what was being reported in the press, left-wing, right-wing, a couple of centrist papers that were trying to hold the center, diary entries, meeting protocols, but no secondary literature. It was everything that was of the moment, a few memoirs in there. And so it began to explore what things looked like on a day-to-day basis, like that. And in a sense, I guess if any of us were to look at what's going to happen in November of this year with a presidential election, it's anybody's guess at this point. But within a week after the election, we're going to have the pundits and the experts and scholars explaining exactly why this outcome, why it ended up the way it was. And so what I did, I left all that aside. I started marching through. And I guess what surprised me was just how precarious Hitler's situation was through that entire time period. leading up to, January of 33, when the chancellorship was there, frankly, and I ended on the morning of the 30th, as soon as he's chancellor, I end the book.
Yeah.
And because we know what happens after that. But it's rather, if you're following it on a day-to-day basis like that, it's practically astonishing that this actually happened. I think Hitler was as astonished as anyone else, as everyone else was by the outcome.
So there are a couple of things that you've touched on that I'd like to pick up on, and maybe later in our conversation we can get into parallels to political developments today, but sort of sticking with your research first, and then actually what happened. You said that you tried to stay of the moment, right? You used newspapers, diary entries, you looked at memoirs. And what you also just said is that through this research, you were able to pick up on what a precarious situation it was. You tried to forget sort of the 2020 benefit that we have when we have hindsight and reflect from a distance. Can you share with us a little bit about that uncertainty, right? What was so precarious in those 6 months leading up to Hitler taking power? I think many people often think of this as sort of an inevitability, the instability of Weimar Republic leading to Hitler taking power and providing sort of a path forward. But not as many people are as aware of the real uncertainty that existed, and as you said, sort of the surprise that maybe even he himself had when he was elected chancellor.
Appointed chancellor. I mean,
Or
we will
yes.
get to that, because it is really all about elections. And Hitler's high watermark was in the July 1932 election, when the National Socialists got 37% of the vote, making them the strongest political force in the country. What normally would happen is that the largest party, that represented the largest party, would form a coalition, and then that person would be appointed chancellor. The reason Hitler got the 37% was because he had made agreements and compromises, one of which he was willing to enter the government. That was the understanding in a coalition government. When push came to shove, Hitler's argument was, and there were partners ready to go enter into coalition with him. Hitler's argument was, well, 37% is 75% of 51%, a simple majority. So it's the relative majority, but I have the majority of the simple majority, so I should have all the power, and I want all the power or nothing. And he went in and had a meeting with Hindenburg, and Hindenburg basically threw him out on his ear. He said, first of all, personally, he disliked the man because of his divisiveness, because of his anti-Semitism. And he said, I would never appoint someone like you chancellor. He said, come back to me with 51%, and then there's nothing you could say, because constitutionally, Hitler would then have the absolute majority and, would have claimed the chancellorship. So Hitler marches out the door, and he says, okay, we're going to go for 51%. They basically gridlock the Reichstag, so you have to call for new elections yet again. So there were the elections in July because of gridlock Reichstag. They call for new elections in November, and Hitler sets out to get 51%. And he says, okay, I'm going to get 51%, and then I have legitimate claim to the chancellorship. So this is his famous leasing of a Lufthansa airplane, and it was the first time in German politics. He'd done it several times in the course of 1932, but it was the first time in German political life that a candidate, or that a political figure, he wasn't actually a candidate, he was promoting the National Socialist Party, but he basically was covering holding 5 rallies a day, and he covered the entire country. Going into the smallest villages, there are accounts of this plane landing in farmers' fields and them, trotting off to the village, holding a speech, holding a rally, and then going off. So we come to the November election. Hitler has spent a colossal amount of money leasing the plane, political propaganda, everything that goes into running a political campaign, claiming he's going to walk out with 51% assumption. He actually ends up with 33%. He loses 2 million votes. So the party is basically bankrupt. He's hemorrhaged 2 million votes. And now there's a crisis within the party itself where one faction is saying, look, let's just enter a coalition government and get a foothold on power. And Hitler stonewalls. He just refuses to do this. He says, come what may. The party then begins hemorrhaging membership because they can no longer pay people. So debts start piling up. There's entries in Goebbels' diaries. You can follow these, and he just goes, one catastrophe after another, so that by January, first of all, the party is bankrupt economically. It's divided politically, and it's in some ways it's lost its even its ideological bearing. And then we have this amazing 3 weeks. And, actually the pundits, when you read the press at the time, it's like, the New York Times says, Hitler is basically washed up. 37% was his high water mark. Everyone is basically saying it's over for the party. My favorite one was there's one pundit who said, Hitler is a man with a great future behind him. And so basically by January 33, it's seen as sort of essentially washed up. And then comes this amazing turnaround, stuns everybody, and I think even Hitler to a certain degree. And that January day is when the real process begins, what we now call the seizure of power. But it was essentially handed to him.
Yeah. And you had an article in Time magazine in April where you sort of outlined the math behind all of this that you just covered, sort of the electoral math of it. And in that article, you talk about how Hitler used democratic means to take power, to sort of usurp power in this way. And that's something that you just touched on. I think it would be interesting to talk a little bit about what some of the reasons were for the demise of the Weimar Republic and how this was able to happen. But before we do that, I have to maybe make a plug for a mentor of yours and mine. I think it's fair to say that you got turned on to the Weimar Republic through classes that you took with Richard Hunt, who, of course, was the longest serving president of the American Council on Germany and also a key figure in this organization's development. He was a scholar of the Weimar Republic at Harvard. And I have to think that he has to be the one that turned you on to this fascinating period of history.
Well, see, the book is dedicated to Rick, and I would say you can see Rick's intellectual fingerprints on virtually every page of it. As you know, Rick was all about nuance. He was all about context. He constantly spoke of shades of gray, not 50, but just all the nuances and the complexities. That was one of his great words. And in writing this book, I didn't try to explain and elucidate. I actually tried to leave the complexity in there to show what the average German, the average voter was facing at that time with all the complexity. As for the demise of the Weimar Republic, let me cite not Rick Hunt, but a man named Hans Frank, who was Adolf Hitler's private lawyer, better known as the Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland, who was executed at Nuremberg for his role in crimes against humanity. While he was awaiting trial in Nuremberg, Hans Frank said something very interesting. And he said that Hitler's rise to power was only possible at that particular moment. He said, had we tried a decade or so earlier, the German people would have simply retreated back to the Kaiser. Mm-hmm. Had we tried a decade later, the German people would have had a full generation imbued with democratic values and practice. But he said we came at this perfect moment when the German people were too far from the past to retreat into it and not far enough into the future to save themselves. Mm-hmm. And so I think I always found that a very interesting observation. And even when I was teaching in Rick's class, his Litnart C45, I was a graduate student there and taught in the section. Yeah, I used to use that as an example and compare that with American democracy and said, look, in some ways, you have to have understanding for Weimar. Only half a generation of people imbued with democratic values. Here you have the United States, 200 plus years, 10 generations of experience with democracy. It's in Americans' DNA. It's just encoded in who we are. We're just wired for that. Mm-hmm. I now look back at that, Steve, and it's fairly naive. So after that very compelling explanation, I think what we've seen in the last couple of years, the last decade or so, you really have to ask yourself that. There are, which brings us back to your question, what happened? Well, there are the issues of unemployment, the economic strain, the 1929 crash, the onerous provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. I actually think in watching what's going on in the United States and also what was going on in Weimar at the time, and once again, following the daily experience as I did, I would actually add a man who often rarely gets mentioned in this context, but his name is Alfred Hugenberg. Mm-hmm. And Hugenberg, as you know, he ran basically this media empire, 1,600 local newspapers across the country. And Hugenberg actually created this as a counterforce to what he saw as a liberal, left-wing media landscape. And he wanted to give voice to a conservative, right-wing, unapologetically nationalistic people. Hugenberg also was like Hitler, he was anti-democratic. But Hitler, as we know, attempted the putsch. That didn't work. And then he said, well, I'll destroy democracy through democratic means, through constitutional means. Hugenberg took a very different approach. What he realized was the essence that democracy relied on consensus and compromise. And his theory was if you could hollow out the center and polarize people, polarize political parties, it would make this type of compromise and consensus on which democracy realized impossible, and the thing would implode on itself. Mm-hmm. So he basically began flooding the landscape with what political landscape with what we call fake news. He would get either provocative stories out there, what we would call wedge issues. One of them was, and he put forward this referendum, he said he called for the abrogation of the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, which a lot of Germans could agree with. He then added an addendum to it, and he said, if we get this law through, the additional provision is that any signatory to the Treaty of Versailles and any public official who has implemented the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles will be tried for treason and executed. Now, it's, and once again, this came up, became a public issue. You look at the local press, you look at all the issues around it, and it was a way of dividing political parties, dividing communities, dividing families, how they would come down. The other one, and this is my favorite, my favorite piece of his fake news, was a story that the German government, in order to pay off the war reparations, the debts, they were enslaving, they were basically recruiting German teenagers, enslaving them, and selling them to the Allies as a way of paying off German war debts. It's absurd, but you read these local newspapers and you see half-page stories about German kids being forced into slavery by the government in Berlin and sent off to French colonies or British colonies, service the war debts. So in any event, and I think what Hugenberg did fairly effectively was to help hollow out this center. And when you look at the U.S. American media landscape over the last many years, I think you can see some of these some very similar dynamics.
And I think, and again, when we come back to sort of maybe a comparison of some trends in Europe, in France where you are, in Germany, here in the US, we can talk a little bit about the hollowing out of the center and perhaps some lessons from this time. But before we do that, let's sort of stay in this period of history, because there's another interesting character that you dedicate a fair amount of ink to, if you will, and that's General Kurt von Schleicher, who also played a role very different from that of Alfred Hugenberg, but also important in thinking about who the cast of characters were who had influence at that time and some of the actions that they took that created an environment where Hitler was able to come to power. Can you tell us a little bit about von Schleicher?
Yeah, Kurt von Schleicher was a German military man who generally walked around in a business suit and was more politician than general. For him, I think politics was war by other means. And there's actually a great New York Times profile of him, I think from the spring or summer of 1932, that says there is one power broker in Berlin, and said anything that's going on politically in Germany can be traced back to Kurt von Schleicher. And Schleicher's real source of power was the fact that he had the respect and ear of President Hindenburg. He had served under him, Schleicher had served under him during the war. It was a man he trusted. It was a man he liked, part of the aristocracy, someone that Hindenburg was comfortable with. And what Schleicher did was to basically play high-level politics. He was the power broker. He would line people up. Famously, Franz von Papen was appointed chancellor. Well, this was Schleicher's doing. When Hindenburg ultimately dismissed von Papen, it was also Schleicher's doing. And Schleicher eventually positioned himself to be appointed chancellor. But by then, Hindenburg had grown tired of Schleicher's games and basically dismissed him. Well, actually, and Schleicher was fairly confident in his position there because, as he said about Hindenburg, he says, I'm the last horse in Hindenburg's stall, because they had kind of exhausted the political landscape. Hindenburg had dismissed or appointed 3 chancellors in a 9-month period. The press was great because they said, at this rate, every German is going to have an opportunity to be appointed chancellor at some point. But Schleicher was fairly confident, and then he really fell out of favor very quickly with Hindenburg. And that's when one was left with, the last alternative. Which was it.
So when you during the course of our conversation, you've sort of talked about some of the weaknesses, but it seems as if there was really a perfect storm in a sense, a series of political failures that helped enable Hitler to come to power and sort of secure his dictatorship. You've touched on some of them, but can you maybe describe for us kind of this timeline during that 6-month period of where you see some of the biggest missteps, some of the biggest failures that allowed that ascent?
Actually, Steve, in some ways, missteps on whose part? Because what you saw was Hitler hit his high watermark with 37% after the July election. And then what you saw was a series of missteps by Hitler, including, when Hindenburg refused to appoint him chancellor, he said, we're going to go into opposition with 37%. We're going to gridlock the Reichstag. We're going to make it impossible to run the country, which will then force new Reichstag elections. At the same time, Hitler came out with a series of positions. There was a lot of disappointment among the voters that Hitler did not enter into a coalition government. So that he lost among a certain number of voters, this 2 million, eventually in that November election had peeled off. There had been I could almost call a Charlottesville type of situation. There was several stormtroopers had kicked to death a Polish worker. They were actually the stormtroopers were put on trial and sentenced to death. Hitler came out during the trial and he said, this is an outrage. He said, if I were chancellor, no foreign life will ever be put above that of a German. But it was an appalling murder, so it alienated additional people. Then Hitler goes on this airplane campaign where he invests, I think it was estimated about 10 million Reichsmarks to lease the plane and run this whole political campaign. But he runs it into debt. So in a sense, what you're seeing is Hitler taking a series of missteps so that by December, it's basically over for him. What the missteps that happened, basically, to my mind, it's a complex scenario. The missteps on the other side, I would say, is that when you came to this November election, you had the National Socialists were down to 33%. The Social Democrats were the next largest party with about 20%. The Communists, if memory serves, has about 18%. But had the center and the left actually agreed to enter into a coalition, they could have actually delivered a chancellorship to Hindenburg for running the country. So I think the misstep there, and this is where I don't want to jump ahead with politics, but I live in France, and we just saw this remarkable thing where you had the crazy left, I mean the whole spectrum of center to left coming together. You had 200 political figures, people who were running for the Assembly Nationale, who said, you know what, I'm willing to sacrifice my chance for being elected for the sake of saving our democracy and our country. In any event, you didn't have that then, so that was a major misstep, because had a chancellor been delivered, it would have happened. That would have stabilized. I think the other misstep was Hindenburg's impatience with Schleicher. What Schleicher went in and asked for, this was in January, he said, I would like, give me another 6 months. He said, just give me 6 more months. The provisions for the reparation, the war payments had actually been rescheduled. The German military had been given more accommodation. A lot of Hitler's talking points had actually been addressed by the government. The absolute crisis of the crash of 1929 was gradually ameliorating, and Schleicher basically said, give us another 6 months to let the situation stabilize. Had he had that 6 months, I mean, you can't predict what would have happened, but it would have been a very different economic, political landscape for Germany, possibly. More importantly, Hitler was, as I said, financially, politically bankrupt. His party was beginning to fracture. The financiers who came in January and were willing to back him, they raised his credit limit to 30 million marks on the assumption that Hitler was chancellor. I don't think they would have been around for long. The Nazi party never would have disappeared, but would probably have continued to suffer attrition and ended up as a significant right-wing party, but never again in a position to, command the political leverage that they had.
Yeah. And I think what you've just described is also what you meant, but when we were talking before about the hollowing out of the core, is that there were so many different factions and different parties that were not able to unite and create a coalition, because that's one of the questions that one of our viewers had as well. Another question just came in, and then I think we can pivot to contemporary politics that you've touched on through the course of our conversation. But one of our viewers is very curious to know what you think of Peter Ross Range's book, The Unfathomable Ascent, which also covers Hitler's rise to power.
Steve, I will confess that I have not read it.
Okay.
And it's interesting because, when I said I put the blinders on for this book, with apologies, I looked at no secondary literature. It was all primary literature going into this, intentionally so.
Yeah. So having said that, let's talk a little bit about the relevance of this narrative, of this story, for contemporary politics. You've talked a little bit about the situation in France, where you're currently based. You've touched on some of the comparisons that are being made with the US and the situation here. What I think is always interesting is to see what sort of lessons one can take from history when dealing with similar situations. I would be reluctant or hesitant to make direct comparisons, to say, history is repeating. But when we look at the rise of right-wing populist movements in countries like Germany and France, and some might even say in the US, a lot of people are thinking about what happened in the early 1930s in Germany. You talked a little bit about the election that was just held in France, obviously the growing support for the right. One of the questions that sort of keeps me awake at night is, in the form of the Alternative for Germany, one has a party which has some anti-democratic sentiments to it, which is being democratically elected. And so what does one do when one has an anti-democratic party which has been democratically elected to office, and it is in power? As you think about the current political landscape in places like France and Germany, do you think of any lessons that we can draw from the time that you looked at very carefully in your book?
Well, I will quote a secondary source now. One of Rick Hunt's favorite historians was Peter Gay, and Rick used to quote this Peter Gay observation, I believe it was Peter Gay, that the Weimar Republic died twice. It was murdered and it committed suicide. You know, the killer we know. I mean, the perpetrators we know. What I find was much more complicated, in some ways more interesting, is this act of state suicide. When a constitutional republic with all the protections, with civil rights protections, referendum, the ability to recall political leaders with the vote. And there I would, when you're saying, well, are we looking at the rise of authoritarian figures? Yes, we are, and there can be some explanation around that. But I would actually go back to that second part of the Peter Gay, which is, it is in a democracy, it's up to the people, it's up to the voters. And I would say what is going on there. What I find rather, well, it's not astonishing, but it's a fact that we need to keep in mind, is that Adolf Hitler, in the best of worlds, his high watermark in a free and open election managed 37%, and that was it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Donald Trump, with all the rhetoric about, with all our concern and all our fear, is polling around right around 51%. So I would say, if you look at what was wrong with Germany at that time, you really need to look at the voting patterns in the United States and ask what is going on there. I guess the other thing, and so yes, there is room for concern, but at the end of the day, it really comes back to the electorate to decide, who they're going to vote for. Mm-hmm. In his wildest dreams, Hitler never could have achieved 51% of the vote. Mm-hmm. What he did, though, what Hitler did do, though, and I think this is, much to the point, Hitler understood the needs of the common man, and were addressing them. The disenfranchised, the working classes. Keep in mind, the name of his party was the National Socialist Workers' Party. So there was this belligerent, rabid nationalism, but it was coupled with a socialism, however you want to define it, and workers. And there's within the party, there was Gregor Strasser, who really, the yin and yang of the Nazi party was, Strasser was number 2 next to Hitler in the party, and in some ways in the north of Germany, much more popular than Hitler. And Hitler was the nationalist, Strasser was the socialist. Mm-hmm. And they knew how to address the working classes. These airplane campaigns that Hitler undertook, he was going to towns and villages that the average German politician had never even heard of, let alone been to. So, and I do think there is this, reach into the heartland America. I mean, there was all this, mea culpa after the collapse of the Blue Wall in 2016. And I actually attended, the New York Times held a celebratory breakfast in 2016 in Paris. And so you got there arrived at 5, 6 in the morning to watch the results come in so we could all celebrate Hillary Clinton's, the first woman president of the United States. When I walked in around 6:15, it felt like a funeral home, and the results had been coming in. And it was either for France or for all of Europe, but a representative for Democrats abroad. And she herself said, we spent too much time at high-end fundraisers, fancy dinners, and not addressing the needs of the real people. So I think that's a long answer, but I think that's what Hitler was addressing, and in some ways, these other parties. I could actually mention, you mentioned AfD. I went to a conference in Berlin just before the elections, outside of Berlin. It was about an hour outside, and I get off at the train station, and in one of these fairly desolate East German towns, and there was this large stand there. It was an AfD stand with young people, pushing the propaganda and things like that. No other political party in sight. And you're going, wow, what is this? And so I do think, it's a extended answer, but I do think it comes back to talking to the people.
Right. And I think, I think you're absolutely right. It's sort of engagement, also communications, right? You spoke a little bit earlier about some of the disinformation campaigns that were led and held in the 1930s and what sort of an impact they had. But of course, individuals who are feeling disenfranchised and that they don't have any part of the prosperity that one's seeing. One of our viewers just asked about, possible parallels between that period in Germany and the current period in the US, and writes, notwithstanding the recent assassination attempt on Donald Trump, wasn't Weimar much more steeped in violence as fallout from World War I than we see in contemporary US?
Absolutely, yeah. You had at the end of, at the end of the war, you had the Freikorps that were established in some ways to try to hold the center, hold the right. What one needs to remember, it was part of Weimar, that is not part of the American landscape, was the serious threat of Bolshevism. There was a strong Communist Party. There was an active Communist Party. It was receiving a lot of support from the outside, and it did represent a threat. It was one of the drums that Hitler beat repeatedly, but there was a serious communist threat, and there was a great deal of street violence between armed communists and the Nazi stormtroopers. And it was, newspapers constantly reported, were reporting what they called the casualty list in the country's ongoing civil war. What is one parallel, though, you can show, there's a cabinet meeting in the summer of 32 where they're trying to bring this violence under control, and it was this long discussion about what you do about controlling weapons, how this proliferation of handguns in the country, what do we do about it? And it was very much the same discussions that are going on in the United States. One proposal was to actually institute the death penalty for anyone convicted of political murder for political reasons. The response was there were so many that would basically turn the courts into killing machines, and that wouldn't be feasible. But there was a real concern about the proliferation of guns and the violence there. We don't see anything quite like this in the United States, but I also saw there's some statistic of whatever it was, 30+% of the Americans think that one could see a civil war in their lifetime.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, and it's coming up in the chat, and we've talked about it a little bit. There are an awful lot of comparisons that have been bandied about between Hitler and Trump. I'd be really interested in sort of getting your take on how valid you think some of these comparisons are. But given the recent announcement of the former president's running mate of J.D. Vance, who himself had made this comparison, but who himself has written extensively about those people in the U.S. who are disenfranchised. I'd also be curious in sort of getting a sense from you of where you would put him. So, first off, how valid is it to be making these comparisons?
Well, let me start with that one observation. If Hitler, if Trump is America's Hitler, as J.D. Vance said, I want to know, now that he's his running mate, who is J.D. Vance, and I guess I would make him America's Joseph Goebbels. I can detail that. I don't need to, but I think he has his place on this very nicely on the spectrum. But yeah, I mean, he clearly, Adolf Hitler is, I think one can talk about similarities, modalities. I think Adolf Hitler, for the crimes that were committed under him, his embrace of every horrific aspect of the Nazi Reich, is a figure unto himself. With that said, I think there are a lot of modalities, and when people do raise this, I think you can tick them off. When I was going through this, when I was, as I say, following the daily press, I was struck by the fact that when Hitler lost the 1932 presidential election against Hindenburg by 6 million votes, he sued in court to have the results of the elections overturned. They threw him out on his ear. Hitler, when Trump says, I'm going to be dictator for a day, okay, Hitler was going to have a dictatorship, but he was going to have a 1,000-year dictatorship, Hitler, Trump for a day. But the very fact that you're invoking the notion of a dictatorship, I think is fairly unsettling. There is one direct quote, which is when Hitler was trying to rally voters, especially his people, to go to the polls for the November 1930 election. He basically said, get yourselves there, es wird wild werden, which translates, be there, it's going to be wild, which is a nice rhymed couplet, as it were. If Hitler history doesn't repeat itself and it rhymes, that's a nice rhyme couplet that I think Rick Hunt would appreciate in particular. But with that said, to my mind, the most compelling comparison between these two men, all of that is basically artifice. It's cosmetic. What really struck me about watching Hitler and watching Trump is this blind determination to simply refuse to see anything as a defeat, to turn any issue to his advantage, and to just pursue things relentlessly. Hitler, Trump, as we know, talks to his base. He only appeals to his base, and people get frustrated. A lot of Republicans get frustrated with this because they like some of it, but a lot of it they don't. but Hitler, that Trump is not going to leave his base. Hitler did exactly the same thing. He knew he didn't care whether it was 37, 33, or 20%. And when the party was in absolute crisis in December and they'd lost 2 million votes, he said, and he was hemorrhaging membership, he said, I don't care because it's leaving us with the hardcore, with the people who really matter. And I think he also understood the power, as Trump does, the power of the relative majority. The ability, if you've got north of 30%, if you've got north of 25%, you can, and you use that strategically, you can crush your opposition or your competitors on the right. You can co-opt them, you can compromise them. And I think when you see what you've seen happen with the Republican Party over the last, 8 years since 2016, very similar to what happened with right-wing politics in Germany. I mean, Hitler started out, they had 12 seats in the Reichstag. And then they increased that tenfold, and then they doubled that. But that he reached the limit, but he knew he didn't need any more. And this is this understanding of destroying democracy through democratic process. He realized with the majority of the base, 75% of 51%, he owned the country.
Yeah. So in the vein of these comparisons, one of our viewers asks what we might learn if we look at or compare Hindenburg and Biden, and writes that they're sort of surprised or recognizing sort of a sense of stubbornness in the aging Hindenburg that seems familiar when it comes to looking at Biden. And the question that the viewer poses is there anything that Hindenburg could have done? Could he have made different choices that would have prevented Hitler from becoming chancellor?
Hindenburg is a complex figure. I will apologize. I will admit that he became a hero for me. The comparison with Biden, look, Hindenburg was 80. Well, let me say this. Hindenburg served in the military. He retired, I think it was in 1914. He came out of retirement to fight, to serve his country. After the war, he went back into retirement. He wrote his memoirs, but he had done what he had done. He had served his country. In 25, when the country went into crisis, they convinced him to run for president. He said, okay, I will do this for one term. He then, as you noted, he was in his 80s by then. He wanted to retire. He only remained in office, only ran for a second term because he knew if he didn't, Hitler would have become president. There were questions about Hindenburg's state of mind. The guy was, when you read the meeting protocols, this was a guy who was at the top of his game all the way through. He is a hero of mine, I will admit, prejudice toward him. However, what happened on January, he stumbled in January, and I personally think he wearied. Schleicher really was, he was the last horse in the stall. He was appalled by the fact that he had to appoint Hitler. I think he had done what he could do, and that is a colossal failure on his part. I'm not excusing him. I think it can erase everything he attempted to do for the country up until that point was erased. As for Biden, I think the difference is the 2 men road. Hindenburg didn't want the job. I think we don't have to go there, but I think that next generation leadership, cultivating that is an important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people would agree with that. As we come to a close, I'd like to maybe end with two questions from viewers that have again to do with Europe and where we are today. One of our viewers writes, would you consider Viktor Orban as a contemporary figure who has successfully used democratic institutions and practices to create an autocracy?
Orban himself talks about an illiberal democracy. Yeah, I think there's no question that he's the model for that.
And do you think, from your research, that there are lessons that we could or should be considering when we think about history, and how we look at Orban?
Well, I think once again, Steve, I think it goes back to the Peter Gay, Weimar democracies die twice. They can be murdered, but they also commit suicide. I think it's incumbent on political leadership to understand the real needs of the people. I live in France. I'm a Macronist. I think, but I also live in the French countryside, and I understand these dynamics. Our village voted 51%, Le Pen. But I also, when I see the day-to-day life of people, and I actually think Macron just piled on a bit too much. I think there was the issue of immigration. There was, the economic situation and employment. I mean, can be difficult. On top of that, he touched that sacred issue of French retirement, which he has to do. But I think there was a bit too much and add to that the war in Ukraine. I just think it was a little too much for the average person. And I myself wonder if you'd pulled one or two of those pieces back, would you have been able to keep more people at the center?
So that's actually a great segue to the final question, which comes from one of our viewers as well, who's curious to know if you think there is who wants to know whether or not you think there is any impact of being a member of the European Union or NATO on this threat of political polarization and what we've talked about in terms of the hollowing out of the middle in those European NATO member states, right? Is this something are those memberships actually shoring up the center, or are they weakening the center?
I think, if I am understanding the question correctly, the potential fragility of the European writ large as a project. I think that needs to be foremost in the minds of European leaders at the end of the day. I think if it requires having to compromise certain issues at home, even having to move the center a bit to the more to the right than you're necessarily comfortable being, but you're keeping the majority of the people there. I think the European Union is Germany and France. I mean, it's and I think given the movement of what we're seeing with the AfD, what we're seeing with the RN in France, I think it should be very concerning. The economic monetary union, I think, can help keep things. I can't see the EU fracturing or falling apart, but I think there can be threats and strains to it, and it should really be foremost in the minds of European leaders. We know why it was formed, and we don't want, and I think it's done a good job addressing those concerns over the last half century, plus, whatever, 80 years now.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely crucial, and I trust that every European leader, especially in France and in Germany, it is the same. And, Macron, okay, his term will be out, but when he ran for president the first time, the first thing he said was, I am a Europeanist. I was born in this system, and I am a European. And he was able to draw people from the left and the right to hold this. Now he's in trouble, but I think the idea to find a politic that where the center, and once again, we come back to the center and the hollowing out of the center. I think it's to avoid this polarization. Hugenberg knew what he was talking about when it came to democracies, and I do think the threats to that and how one can manage things so that the center holds.
Yeah. Well, Tim, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. This has been really fascinating. It's a really interesting story that you tell in your book about a very finite period of history, but it's also been wonderful to talk with you about how that story has relevance today. I mean, again, I think it's always dangerous when one makes direct comparisons between a period in history and the present. But you have really a unique vantage point in terms of thinking about what are some of the things that we could have or should have learned from history, and how does that play out in similar situations across Europe, but also here in the US today. So Tim, many, many thanks for taking the time to talk with us. This has been a great exchange. And of course, thanks to all of our viewers for some wonderful questions as well.
Thank you so much, Steve. And let's hope for the future.
Exactly.